The phone calls stopped. The texts, the visits, the laughter, it all just stopped. Tamika Huston, 24 years old and full of life, vanished without a trace in the summer of 2004. Her family waited for her to walk through the door, waited for a call, waited for anything. But what they got was silence. A silence so profound it felt like the world itself had swallowed her whole. When her family entered her apartment, their worst fears began to take shape. The air was heavy, still, and empty. Tamika's dog, Macy, was there, weak, starving, and alone. The only living presence in a home that now felt like a ghost of what it once was. Her belongings sat untouched, as though she had simply stepped out and never returned. But there was no sign of a struggle, no note, no explanation. Where was Tamika? Her family's concern grew into desperation. They called the police, filed reports, and retraced her steps. But days turned into weeks, and the search yielded nothing. To outsiders, it was easy to dismiss. She was young, independent. Maybe she just needed space. Maybe she left on her own. But her family knew better. This wasn't Tamika. She wouldn't abandon her responsibilities, wouldn't leave Macy, wouldn't vanish without a word. Months passed, and the silence around Tamika's case became deafening. Media coverage was scarce, the public's attention fleeting. Her family fought to keep her name alive, to remind the world that Tamika mattered, that her life was worth searching for. But their pleas were met with indifference. And as time wore on, hope began to waver. Then, over a year later, the case broke wide open. A name surfaced, a confession followed. The truth came crashing down, unraveling a story of betrayal and violence so chilling it left her family reeling. For over a year, the answers they had been desperately seeking were closer than anyone had realized, hidden in plain sight. This is the story of Tamika Huston, a young woman who vanished without explanation, her fate buried beneath layers of silence and missed opportunities. What happened to Tamika? Why did it take so long to uncover the truth? And what does her case say about the way we value certain lives over others? To understand Tamika Huston's disappearance, we need to start with who she was. A young woman full of ambition and warmth. Born and raised in Spartanburg, South Carolina, Tamika was a free spirit who lit up any room she entered. She was fiercely independent, yet deeply connected to her family. She had a close relationship with her aunt, Reva, who often described her as a loving and vibrant soul with a magnetic personality. At 24, Tamika was studying nursing, a career she had chosen to help others. It was her dream to make a difference in the world. Outside of school, she was passionate about singing, a talent that those who knew her say was undeniable. She had hopes of one day recording music and sharing her voice with the world. Tamika had big dreams, but she also had a practical side. She worked hard, cared for her beloved dog Macy, and stayed connected with the people she loved. But in May 2004, that vibrant life took an unexpected and chilling turn. Tamika's family hadn't heard from her in days, which was unusual. At first, they tried to rationalize it. Maybe she was busy with school, maybe her phone wasn't working. But when more time passed, unease set in. Her Aunt Reva decided to check on her, and what she found changed everything. Tamika's apartment was still and unnervingly quiet. Her dog, Macy, was in distress, thin, hungry, and desperate for attention. It was clear that Macy had been left alone for far too long. But there was no sign of Tamika. Her belongings were all in place, her car was parked outside, and there was no indication she had planned to leave. Her family knew immediately that something was wrong. They reported her missing, but the response from authorities was lackluster. Tamika was an adult after all. Adults sometimes leave without telling anyone, they were told. But her family refused to accept that explanation. This wasn't like her. She was responsible, grounded, and wouldn't abandon her life without reason. Days turned into weeks, and the search intensified. Her family put up posters, contacted local news stations, and pleaded for help. But as is the case with so many missing women of color, Tamika's story struggled to gain the attention it deserved. While other cases dominated the national headlines, her family felt they were screaming into a void. No leads, no breakthroughs, just silence. Tamika's family refused to give up. They knew that every passing day was critical, but they also knew the odds were stacked against them. Without significant media coverage, tips were scarce. And without evidence, investigators were left with little to go on. It seemed as though Tamika had vanished into thin air. The days stretched into months, and with every passing moment, Tamika's family grew more desperate. They tirelessly retraced her steps, reaching out to anyone who might have seen or heard from her. Friends, acquaintances, co-workers, no one had answers. The police began their investigation, but progress was painstakingly slow. Leads were scarce, and without physical evidence, the case stalled. Tamika's family was left to carry the burden of keeping her name alive. Her Aunt Reva became her most vocal advocate, reaching out to local media and urging anyone who would listen to help. She fought for Tamika's story to be told. But in a world saturated with news, the case of a young black woman from Spartanburg didn't seem to resonate beyond the local community. It was a devastating reality, a glaring reminder of the inequities in media attention for missing persons cases. Despite the lack of coverage, Reva refused to let Tamika's name fade. She organized vigils, distributed flyers, and worked tirelessly to keep hope alive. But with each passing day, the weight of not knowing grew heavier. The same question haunted her family: what happened to Tamika? As investigators began to dig deeper, they uncovered a chilling piece of information. Tamika had been in a volatile relationship before her disappearance. While the details were unclear, the relationship was known to have its ups and downs, raising questions about whether it could be connected to her sudden vanishing. But that wasn't the only lead. Over time, police interviewed several individuals who had interacted with Tamika in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. One name, in particular, stood out: Christopher Hampton. He was a local man with a troubled history, and someone who had reportedly been acquainted with Tamika. Police couldn't immediately tie him to her disappearance, but his name lingered in the background of the investigation like an unanswered question. For more than a year, the case remained unsolved. Tamika's family clung to hope, but also braced themselves for the worst. As the seasons changed, the emptiness left by her absence only grew more profound. It was as if Tamika had been swallowed by the world, her presence erased, and her story forgotten by everyone except those who loved her most. Then, in 2005, everything changed. The police received a tip, a piece of information that cracked the case wide open. Christopher Hampton, the man who had been loosely connected to Tamika during the initial investigation, had started to unravel. Details emerged that painted a horrifying picture of what had happened to Tamika. a picture so dark and devastating it left her family shattered. After more than a year of waiting, hoping, and searching, the truth was finally revealed. Tamika Huston had been murdered. Christopher Hampton, the man whose name had surfaced early in the investigation, confessed to killing her. He admitted to luring her to his home during an argument, where things escalated violently. It was a senseless act of cruelty, and one that robbed Tamika of her future and her family of their peace. As law enforcement delved deeper into Tamika Huston's disappearance, the investigation unraveled like a tightly wound thread slowly coming undone. Detectives initially pursued every possible lead, speaking to neighbors, friends, and classmates, hoping to uncover even the faintest trace of her whereabouts. But weeks turned into months, and frustration began to mount. The clues were elusive, the trail cold, and Tamika's absence cast an increasingly long shadow over the Spartanburg community. Then came the breakthrough. A discovery that turned a stagnant investigation into a race against time. A search of Tamika's apartment revealed faint traces of blood beneath freshly cleaned surfaces. Forensic analysis confirmed the blood matched Tamika's DNA. The chilling find confirmed investigators' worst fears. Foul play was no longer just a possibility, but a devastating reality. But who could have harmed a young woman so full of life? The search for answers led investigators to an ex-boyfriend, Christopher Hampton. Initially cooperative, Hampton's story quickly began to unravel under scrutiny. His behavior raised red flags. His timeline was inconsistent, his answers evasive. Then, a startling confession emerged from a guilt-ridden acquaintance of Hampton's. Hampton had borrowed a car shortly after Tamika's disappearance and returned it reeking of bleach. This critical lead pushed detectives to execute a thorough search of Hampton's residence, where they uncovered damning evidence. A set of keys belonging to Tamika and additional blood traces. Confronted with mounting evidence, Hampton confessed to Tamika's murder, claiming an argument had escalated to violence. He admitted to discarding her body in a remote wooded area, leading investigators to the tragic discovery of Tamika's remains over a year after her disappearance. The courtroom became the stage for the next chapter in this tragic story. As Christopher Hampton faced charges of murder, the trial drew widespread attention, not only for the gruesome details of Tamika's death, but for what it revealed about the justice system's handling of cases involving women of color. Prosecutors painted Hampton as a manipulative and violent individual who had shown no remorse for his actions. The jury heard harrowing testimony from investigators, forensic experts, and Tamika's grieving family. Tamika's aunt, Reva, delivered an emotional statement that silenced the courtroom. With tears streaming down her face, she spoke of Tamika's dreams, her laughter, and the hole her absence left in their lives. "We trusted the system to find her," she said, her voice steady despite the pain. "And now we trust it to give her the justice she deserves." The defense attempted to portray Hampton's actions as impulsive, the result of a momentary lapse in judgment rather than premeditation. But the evidence of his calculated attempts to cover up the crime, cleaning the apartment, disposing of Tamika's body, and lying to investigators was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for just a few hours before delivering a verdict: guilty of murder in the first degree. Christopher Hampton was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Tamika's family, the verdict brought a bittersweet sense of closure. Justice had been served, But it could never undo the pain of losing a daughter, a niece, a friend. Outside the courthouse, Riva spoke to reporters. "We will never stop missing her, but we take comfort in knowing her voice was not silenced in vain." Tamika's story is bigger than this courtroom. It's a call to action for all of us. Yet, even as Hampton's sentencing marked the end of the legal battle, the reverberations of Tamika's case continued to be felt far and wide. It became a symbol of the need for systemic change within law enforcement, the media, and society itself. Tamika's name became a rallying cry for those demanding justice for victims who are too often overlooked, ensuring that her story would never fade into obscurity. Tamika Huston's story is one that resonates deeply. A young woman with so much promise, taken too soon. Her disappearance and tragic murder exposed not only the personal anguish of her family, but also the systemic failings in how society values and protects its most vulnerable. Tamika's case was not just about finding justice for her. It was about shining a light on the broader issues of bias, neglect, and inequality that continue to plague missing persons cases, especially for women of color. Her family's unwavering determination turned their grief into a movement, ensuring Tamika's name would never be forgotten. Through their advocacy, they've inspired changes in law enforcement practices, challenged media biases, and provided hope to countless other families facing similar heartbreak. Tamika may no longer be with us, but her legacy remains a beacon of resilience and a call to action for all of us. As we reflect on Tamika's life and the lessons her story teaches, we must ask ourselves, how can we ensure that no family is ever left to fight for their loved one alone? How can we hold ourselves, the media, and law enforcement accountable to treat every missing persons case with the urgency and dignity it deserves? As we close this chapter, let us reflect on the lessons Tamika's story teaches us. How can we, as a society, ensure that every missing persons case receives the urgency and attention it deserves? How can we honor the memories of those who are gone by fighting for justice, accountability, and systemic reform? If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Share Tamika's name, her story, and the lessons her case has taught us. Support organizations that fight for missing persons and advocate for change in your own communities. Together, we can be the voice for those who can no longer speak. Thank you for watching M17 True Crime Story. As always, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Share your theories, your reflections, and your hopes for a better future. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Your support helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. Before we go, here's a glimpse of what's coming next on M17 True Crime Story. In our next episode, we'll uncover the mysterious case of a beloved Oregon teacher who vanished without a trace. A cryptic note, whispers of a hidden life, and a community desperate for answers set the stage for one of the most baffling disappearances we've ever covered. Stay tuned for The Vanished Educator, a case that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. Until next time, stay safe, take care of each other, and remember, every story matters. This is M17 True Crime Story signing off.